Gideon, thank you so much for joining us here at SuperReturn International. A fascinating presentation on stage then, and obviously the audience was very keen to hear your views on the state of globalisation particularly, and what we're seeing in terms of both challenges and opportunities in that area.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, globalization has required a sort of underlying political consensus that countries need to basically get along enough to invest in each other. And that you've seen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's broken down, massive sanctions on Russia, and really the Russians, their efforts to cut the Russia out of the world economy. Now the question is, will that just be an isolated thing? Will it just be Russia? And I think we have to at least consider the possibility that relations between China and the United States are deteriorating to such a level that you'll at least get significant restrictions on investment. I think you look particularly at technology, where there's a kind of race for dominance, and the Americans are now wary of exporting key technologies to China, and China is wary of its reliance on America for certain things such as semiconductors. So there are definitely pressures there. But at the same time, as there are opportunities. For example, I think India is a country that is set to benefit from some of this, because as people try to become less reliant on supply chains that are very centered on China, they may look to the world's other giant country in Asia, the only other country with a population of over 1 billion people. Apple, for example, are opening their first factory to make iPhones in India, and I think you'll see some diversification to basically Asia ex-China, and that a lot of that will be India or countries like Vietnam and others in Southeast Asia.
And what do you see is happening? Obviously, we don't know how long the war in Ukraine is going to last. What do you see happening in terms of energy? Because that's the other key area that's going to have so much influence on what happens globally.
Well, I think that the West is going to make a serious effort to wean itself off Russian energy. Russia is, or at least was before the war, the world's energy superpower, the biggest exporter of, if you put all forms of energy together, the world's biggest exporter of that. So it's not an easy job. The country we're sitting in, Germany, got more than 50% of its gas from Russia. And there aren't that many available alternative supplies. So Russia is still, even though it's sanctioned, getting over €1 billion a day in revenues from oil and gas exports. But I think the clock's ticking on that. The Germans are doing their utmost to diversify. They're building their first LNG ports, liquid natural gas for imports of that. They're looking at renewables. They're looking at opening up new fields and collaborative projects with countries such as Senegal and so on. So there are huge efforts to go on. One German official I spoke to said that he thought it would take them roughly 3 years to cut themselves off from Russian oil and gas. Now, if you're Ukraine, that's not fast enough, but for a major economy like Germany, that's pretty dramatic. And again, this official said that Russia had been looking at something like 30 years of revenue from oil and gas, and they're now looking at 3 years.
And obviously connected to that are huge investment opportunities in all of those energy providers, in the seeking out of renewables, and that's potentially something this audience are going to be very interested in too.
Yeah, completely, because if you have an energy revolution like that, you need new sources of energy, and I think that some of it will be the sort of classic renewables, things like solar, wind and so on, but actually some of it's going to be looking for the stuff that you need to put in batteries. A lot of it's going to be battery developed. So mining, oddly, is going to have a boom because you need rare earths, things like cobalt, of which incidentally 70% comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there are these odd little tension points in the world economy where they're difficult, but also there are opportunities. The people who can supply those needs will be doing well.
You talk there about odd little tension points, as you put it. It's quite extraordinary to think how fragile some of these supply chains are. You mentioned semiconductors as an example of that. Tell me what you've seen in terms of those.
Yeah, well, I think that the fragility of supply chains actually partly came home to us during the pandemic, where suddenly we realized that a lot of personal protective equipment, something like 70–80% was coming out of China, and that there was one factory in Malaysia which had most of the world's supply of latex gloves, which was suddenly critical. But yes, semiconductors really are the key to the world economy. They're, what power our phones, power our defense systems, our electricity, whatever you want to talk about, really. And one of the paradoxes of the situation we're in is that there is a single semiconductor factory in Taiwan, a company called TSMC, that makes the world's most advanced semiconductors. About 50–60% comes from this single place. And of course, it's a geopolitical flashpoint. Taiwan is under threat from invasion from China. So people are suddenly thinking, my goodness, if that factory were destroyed in a war or taken over by China in a situation where they weren't exporting to the United States, what would that mean? Now, TSMC are trying to build a new fabrication factory in the United States under pressure from the Americans. But whether they'll be able to make the most advanced stuff in the US and how quickly is not clear. There are other companies as well that are critical to this. Samsung are big semiconductor makers, although they're not as far as advanced as TSMC. There's a Dutch company called ASML, which is critical to the world's semiconductor industry. And again, it's a single factory in the Netherlands, which is really crucial to all of this. So I think, yes, although we think of the world being a world where everything's interconnected and there's always opportunities and alternatives, in some crucial technologies there aren't that many alternatives.
And it's really key that an industry like this has the expertise in and talent in its teams to start seeing and gazing into the crystal ball, if you like, and seeing into that future and what the repercussions of all of these things are going to be.
Absolutely, and I think the people who read the geopolitical situation right are the ones who, in business terms, will do best, because they've got to try to figure out, okay, so we're in this situation now where, for example, Russia is no longer really a country that most Western countries can trade with. So that's a problem, but it's also an opportunity. And where are the opportunities? And where else might geopolitical tensions bubble up? Where can we see those tensions already rising? You have to have some sort of view on how much business you continue to do with China. I mean, there will be those who say, actually, there's not going to be disruption, and the bet to make is on continuity with China because it's so integrated. And there will be those who say, no, you know what, this is not going to last, and we need to start looking at, well, where will be the opportunities for those who think we need to diversify out of China.
What key message do you think, just finally, this audience should take away from what you have to say today?
Well, keep doing business, but be careful that the world in which you've got used to operating since really the fall of the Berlin Wall in this city, in 1989, was one of ever-expanding opportunities, of borders coming down, of more and more markets becoming open to investment. And then I think now, the fall of the Berlin Wall is a big political change. We're now in another era of big political change, but one that's actually, I think, restricting some opportunities and therefore making others even more important. So you've got to be more selective. And I think you've got to take politics into account now in a way that you really didn't have to for, a couple of decades.
Gideon, fascinating to hear your insights. Thank you so much for sharing them with us today.
My pleasure.